Whilst the world of football has become enamored by the glitz and glamour of the masculine side of things, the women's side of the beautiful game has been tirelessly working away at carving out its own space away from the shared limelight. For what seems like an eternity, football's association with women has been mired with ridicule and inferiority, as the sport was and still is largely regarded as a game solely for men. This is a tragically short-sighted view, as women's football is far from being the internet meme that is perceived to be by so many millions around the world. The latest rise to prominence of women's football as a whole is a result of the decades-long work put in place by the iconic juggernauts of the past, present, and future of women's football. It was in the latter half of the 1900s that women's football began to capture the imagination of the public eye, as the centuries-old game of football, so commonly associated with masculinity, aggression, physical emphasis, and regional identity, was flipped on its head by the Women's World Cups of 1970 and 1971. Whilst the inaugural tournament held in Italy and won by Denmark can never have its place in history disregarded, it is the lesser-known precursor that led to the powder keg that was the 1971 Women's World Cup. Held in Mexico, an initial glance would present an unassuming event filled with the commonplace spectacles that one would expect from a momentous occasion like a World Cup. However, what made this World Cup so seismic and special was its renegade status. To this day, the FIFA Association does not officially recognize the 1971 Mexico Women's World Cup or any women's tournament for that fact, which was prior to 1988, which is due to them taking place without the governing body's blessing. The absence of FIFA from these renegade events, at least in an official capacity, did nothing to stop the run of momentum that the women's game was about to embark on. This is best exemplified in the words of one of the women who participated in that tournament. Chris Lockwood, one of the England women's 14-person strong squad in Mexico 71, was quoted, "We'd gone from playing on park pitches and suddenly we were running out in front of 80,000 people inside huge stadiums. It was an unknown world." Lockwood herself was one of the hundreds, if not thousands of women across the footballing world who were actively rebelling against the ban on women playing football due to it being branded quite unsuitable for females and ought to be encouraged. And if Italy 70 was the dipping of the toes into the pool of uncertainty, then Mexico 71 was the women's game jumping headfirst into the deep end. The main sponsor of the tournament, Martini and Rossi, spared no expense in making the Women's World Cup an unforgettable event, to the point that 110,000 eager fans fervently attended the final, contested by the reigning and defending champions Denmark, who came out on top 3-0 over the hosts, Mexico. The unrivaled success of this World Cup was an undeniably massive act of defiance that saw football associations across the globe finally lifting their respective bans on women's football that had been in place going as far back as 1921 in England. As the associations began to reintegrate women's football back into their bodies, massive potential was realized in the exceptional promise that would officially become women's club football. It is important to note that women's club football in the 20th century was by no means a novel revelation, but was simply a revitalization of the initial attraction that drew women to the beautiful game in the first place. Prior to the English FA's ban on women's football in 1921, Women's Association football was a massive attraction across the United Kingdom, with its peak being characterized by the famous Dick Kerr's Ladies FC 1920 Boxing Day match with St. Helens Ladies, which drew a total crowd of 53,000 people and an excess of 14,000 eagerly waiting outside the grounds, which for the time was simply unheard of. But in a broader and wider context, this was a victory for the women's game just by the attendance records alone. At the time, crowd attendances were averaging 30,000 people, which was for the male top division matches. This is equivalent to a women's Super League match being attended by more people than a Premier League match. Such an insurmountable feat for the time was unheard of and provided validity to the fact that women's football was an undeniable attraction in the eyes of the public. Due to the ban of women's football, the natural and organic growth was hampered, and because of this, one cannot help but wonder what the landscape of football today would be like. Would Lily Parr be as iconic as Sir Bobby Charlton? Would Marta outshine the likes of Ronaldinho? Or even, would the GOAT conversation be more of Lloyd versus Wambach instead of Messi versus Ronaldo? Though these questions are unlikely to be pondered on a global scale or even be the topic of discussion on a major footballing program on the BBC or Sky Sports, it is evidently clear that women's football is a sleeping giant that is finally starting to wake up from its slumber.